Wow. What do you say about Psalm 109? I don't know what your reaction was as you first read it. There were two things that went through my mind. Firstly, we're often told the Psalms are the songbook or the prayer book of the Bible. But I don't think I could sing or pray this. And then second, I noticed the psalm, it starts and ends with praise, which suggests that what's in the middle is something that should move me to praise God. And that made me feel pretty uncomfortable. But as I've pondered this psalm and as I've got some really helpful help from things I've read and listened to, I'm starting to see that rightly understood, there is a way I could pray this psalm. There is a way I could praise God because of what it says. There's no way I can do justice to this psalm in 5 minutes. So instead, I want to do something a bit different this morning. I want to give you 4 footholds to help you with these so-called imprecatory psalms. And then I'm going to encourage you to go back and look at Psalm 109 again. And if that word imprecatory has you reaching for your dictionary, don't worry, I didn't do Latin at school either, so I don't know what it means either. So I had to look it up. It means to curse. And that's why I say these are so-called imprecatory psalms, because here's the first foothold I want to give you. These psalms are prayers. They're not curses. The psalmist isn't invoking a curse in a battle with a personal enemy. Instead, he's praying to the God who acts with perfect justice. And he's asking God to bring about that justice. Which quickly brings us to our second foothold. The imprecatory psalms are prayers asking God to do what he has promised to do. Back in Genesis 12, God makes a wonderful promise to Abraham. If you've ever done any sort of Bible overview, I'm sure the idea of God's people living in God's place under God's blessing is something you're familiar with. It comes from Genesis 12, and yet as part of that same promise, while God does say to Abraham, I will bless those who bless you, he also goes on to say, and whoever curses you, I will curse. It's been there since the start of God's dealings with his people. It's there throughout the Old Testament. It's even there in the New Testament. To ask God to do what he has said he will do, that is very different from taking the law into our own hands and taking revenge upon our enemies. And the psalmist can pray like this. Here's the third foothold. Because his enemies are God's enemies. These psalms are about those whose hostility is first and foremost against God. And because their hostility is against God, it's also against God's king, as it is with this psalm, and against God's people, as it is in some of the other imprecatory psalms. Here in Psalm 109, we've got a psalm of David, a psalm written by God's chosen king. And to threaten God's king is also to threaten God's people and to threaten God's honor. That's why David can pray like this. And for part of his life, his desires, they lined up really well with God's desires. And so for a large part of his life, his enemies really would have been God's enemies. But of course, if you know anything about King David, you'll know there are large bits of his life which didn't line up with what God would have wanted. Many ways in which he fell short. And what we see in embryo with David, well, of course, it's perfectly seen in Jesus. Jesus is the only man in history who has loved God the Father so much that his enemies are precisely the same as the Father's enemies. You see, these psalms are psalms that are ultimately prayed by Jesus. And introducing him takes us to the fourth foothold we need when we're thinking about these psalms. Here it is, number 4. Conversion is a possible way in which these prayers may be answered. When the psalmist asks for God to carry out his judgment, it's possible that God will answer that prayer by choosing for that judgment to fall upon Christ as he makes one of his enemies a reconciled friend. I wouldn't be surprised if the very first Christian believers prayed this prayer about Saul of Tarsus as he persecuted and ravaged the church. And yet look what the grace of God did in that man's life. Well, there we go. 4 really quick footholds to get you going in the imprecatory psalms. These psalms are prayers, not curses. They're prayers asking God to do what he has promised to do. And they're prayed most ultimately by a man whose enemies were God's enemies. First and foremost, they're prayed by Jesus himself. And they're prayers which may be answered by those who are being prayed about, being saved from the judgment that's being asked for. Well, with those footholds to guide you, why not go back and have another look at Psalm 109? Read it again with those things in mind. But even with those footholds in place, you quite reasonably want someone to hold your hand as you start to explore this psalm again. Well, I've put a couple of links to a sermon and a talk in the video description, which will help you as you go about your journey.